In the darkest pages of the Book of Enoch, among accounts that Christian orthodoxy decided to hide from the world, lies the story of a being whose name still resonates in the whispers of those seeking to understand the origin of evil. Azazel, the Watcher, who descended from heaven not to protect humanity, but to teach them secrets that were destined to remain in the celestial heights. His story is not simply that of a fallen angel, but the chronicle of how forbidden knowledge can become the deepest curse humanity has ever known. The apocryphal texts describe him as responsible for teaching men the art of war, the making of weapons, the cosmetics that hide true nature, and the metals that would forge both tools and instruments of destruction. But behind this ancestral narrative lies something that transcends the dusty pages of millennial manuscripts. Perhaps you recognize that sensation of being awake in the quiet of the night, when the world sleeps, but your mind remains alert, navigating questions that find no answers in daily conversations. That spiritual restlessness that leads you to search for something deeper, something that explains why the soul sometimes feels so heavy, as if carrying knowledge it would prefer not to possess. Tonight, as the story of Azazel unfolds before you, perhaps you will find in its echoes a different understanding of what it means to seek answers in the darkness. Allow me to accompany you on this nocturnal journey where words become a balm for the restless mind, and where ancient mysteries offer, paradoxically, the peace you have been seeking. The story of Azazel begins long before his name was whispered with fear in Hebrew traditions. In the primordial heavens, when creation was still young, and the boundary between the divine and the terrestrial remained clearly defined, Azazel was one of the 200 angels known as Watchers, celestial beings whose mission was to observe and protect humanity in its first steps upon the earth. The Book of Enoch describes with meticulous detail how these luminous beings contemplated from the celestial heights the development of the human race, silent witnesses to a species that grew in numbers but remained vulnerable, ignorant of the secrets that could accelerate their evolution or precipitate their destruction. The name Azazel resonates with profound meanings in ancestral languages. Some scholars translate it as the strength of God or God strengthens, a bitter irony considering the destiny that awaited both the angel and those who would be touched by his teachings. Others interpret his name as the scapegoat, connecting him directly to the expiation rituals described in Leviticus, where the sins of the people were symbolically transferred to an animal that was sent to the desert, to the domain of Azazel. This duality in the interpretation of his name reflects the complexity of his nature, a being that simultaneously granted power and condemnation, knowledge and spiritual ignorance. The Enochian tradition recounts that Azazel did not act alone in his decision to descend to earth. Along with him came other watchers, each carrying fragments of celestial knowledge that had been reserved exclusively for divine beings. Semjaza, who would lead this silent rebellion, Barakijal, who would teach astronomy, Kokabel, who would reveal the secrets of the constellations, and many others whose names have been preserved in texts that religious authorities considered too dangerous for the faith of common believers. But among all of them, Azazel stood out for the particular nature of his teachings, knowledge that would forever change the trajectory of human civilization. The descent of the Watchers was not an act of open rebellion like the fall of Lucifer, but something more subtle, and profoundly disturbing, it was an act of misunderstood compassion, of love that transformed into obsession, of benevolence that became corruption. The apocryphal texts describe how these celestial beings observed the daughters of men and found them beautiful. But beyond physical attraction, there was something deeper, a fascination with mortality, with the fragility they did not know, with the human capacity to experience intense emotions within the limited framework of a finite life. When Azazel first set foot on solid ground, he carried with him the weight of decisions that would reverberate through millennia. He did not come as a conqueror, but as a teacher. But the lessons he would impart would have consequences that not even his celestial wisdom could completely foresee. The Book of Enoch is specific in describing Azazel's teachings. He revealed to men how to forge swords and knives, how to create shields and armor, how to work precious metals to create ornaments and jewelry. But more significant still, he taught women the art of beautifying themselves, of using cosmetics, of adorning their bodies with bracelets and ornaments, knowledge that the ancient texts consider as the root of vanity and moral corruption. These teachings may seem harmless from a modern perspective, but the authors of the Book of Enoch saw them as fundamental violations of the divine order. Metallurgical knowledge was not simply technical, it was transformative. When humans learned to forge weapons, they not only acquired more efficient hunting tools, but developed the capacity to wage war in ways that were previously unthinkable. Metal swords could cut deeper than stone spears. Bronze shields could withstand impacts that would shatter wooden defenses. Azazel had granted humanity the power to kill each other with an efficiency that would forever change the nature of human conflict. But Azazel's teachings went beyond warfare. When he revealed the secrets of cosmetics and ornamentation, he was introducing concepts that the texts consider as the seeds of vanity, seduction, and deception. The knowledge of how to alter natural appearance was not seen simply as beautification, but as a form of falsification of divine creation. The women who learned these secrets not only became more attractive, but acquired power over men, the ability to influence and manipulate through physical appearance, altering social dynamics in ways that the ancient texts considered dangerous to the established order. The Enochian narrative describes in disturbing detail how these teachings spread rapidly among the human population. The knowledge that Azazel had imparted did not remain limited to a chosen few, but spread like a fire that consumes everything in its path. Men began to forge weapons not only for hunting and defense, but for attack and conquest. Women developed arts of seduction that altered relationships between genders, introducing elements of manipulation and artificiality, where there had previously been simplicity and naturalness. Metallurgy evolved from the creation of practical tools to the manufacture of luxury objects that fed greed and envy. The apocryphal texts are particularly eloquent in describing the consequences of these innovations. Humanity, which had previously lived in relative harmony with the natural order, began to experience levels of violence and corruption that were unknown in previous generations. Wars became bloodier and more destructive with the new weapons that Azazel had taught them to create. Social relationships became complicated with the introduction of artifices and deceptions that altered honest communication between people. The search for precious metals and ornaments led to exploitation and conflict over resources that were previously considered unnecessary. The Book of Enoch recounts that these changes did not go unnoticed in the heavens. The archangels who had remained faithful observed with growing horror how the teachings of Azazel and the other watchers transformed humanity in ways that contradicted the original divine plan. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel raised their voices in protest, bringing before the throne of the Most High the cries of the earth, which groaned under the weight of corruption that spread like an unstoppable plague. Their celestial reports described a humanity that had lost its primordial innocence, that had been contaminated with knowledge it was not prepared to handle responsibly. The divine response, according to the Enochian texts, was swift and definitive. The judgment that fell upon Azazel and his fellow watchers was not only punishment for disobedience, but a necessary cosmic correction to prevent corruption from spreading beyond repair. But the specific nature of Azazel's punishment reveals deep aspects of divine justice as understood by the authors of these ancient texts. While other watchers were simply imprisoned in places of darkness until the day of final judgment, Azazel's destiny was more complex and symbolically significant. The Book of Enoch describes how the archangel Raphael received specific instructions about the treatment to be given to Azazel. He would not simply be chained like his companions, but would be bound hand and foot and thrown into the darkness of the desert of Dudael, a place the texts describe as rough and desolate, where sharp stones would create a natural prison so inhospitable it would become eternal torment. But more significant still, it is ordered that heavy and rough stones be thrown upon him, covering him completely, so that he cannot see the light, thus preparing him to be cast into the fire on the great day of judgment. This description of Azazel's punishment contains deep symbolisms that resonate through later mystical traditions. The desert of Dudael is not simply a geographical place, but a representation of spiritual exile, of complete separation from the divine light that once illuminated his celestial existence. The stones that cover him symbolize the weight of the consequences of his acts, each rock representing the altered lives, the initiated wars, the corruptions sown through his teachings. The darkness in which he is submerged represents the spiritual blindness that results from using divine knowledge for purposes that contradict celestial will. But the Enochian texts go beyond simply describing Azazel's physical punishment. They reveal a deeper theological dimension. All guilt of sin on earth is attributed to him. This total attribution of responsibility is significant because it suggests that, from the perspective of these ancient texts, Azazel was not simply a participant in humanity's corruption, but its principal architect. His specific teachings about metallurgy, cosmetics, and ornamentation are seen as the catalysts that unleashed all the subsequent evils that would afflict the human race. This theological perspective raises profound questions about the nature of knowledge and responsibility. Was Azazel truly guilty of corruptions that arose from the human use of knowledge that, in itself, might be considered neutral? Metals can forge both plows and swords. Cosmetics can express both art and deception. The Enochian tradition suggests that Azazel was guilty not only of imparting this knowledge, but of doing so at a time and in a manner when humanity was not prepared to handle such powerful tools with wisdom and moderation. reflect for a moment on what we have just explored? Is there not something in this ancient story that touches a very personal fiber in your own nocturnal experience? That sensation of being awake while the world rests, carrying questions about the origin of suffering, about why knowledge sometimes feels more like a burden than a blessing. Perhaps you have experienced that strange melancholy that comes from understanding too much about human nature, from seeing the connections between seemingly innocent decisions and devastating consequences. Your mind, which refuses to rest in these silent hours, might be processing its own versions of the dilemmas that Azazel faced. Share with me in the comments, is there any knowledge in your life that you wish you had not acquired? Any understanding that, although valuable, has made the world feel heavier on your shoulders? You are not alone in this experience. Many of us carry the paradox of seeking truth while simultaneously longing for the simplicity of ignorance. Your reflection on this not only helps you process these complex feelings, but also offers validation and understanding to others who may be navigating the same turbulent waters of expanded consciousness. The story of Azazel also finds echoes in traditions that extend far beyond primitive Judaism and esoteric Christianity. In Mesopotamian mythology, there are accounts of divine beings who descended to teach civilizational arts to humanity, but these narratives generally present these interventions as beneficial. The Sumerian Anunnaki, for example, are described as gods who brought agricultural, architectural, and astronomical knowledge that elevated humanity from a primitive state toward civilization. The crucial difference in the Enochian tradition is the moral perspective. What other cultures celebrated as progress, the authors of the Book of Enoch interpreted as corruption. This tension between progress and corruption, between technological advancement and spiritual degradation, is one of the most relevant themes of Azazel's story for the contemporary mindset. We live in an era where scientific and technological knowledge has reached heights that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. But we also experience deep anxieties about the consequences of this progress. Nuclear energy can power cities or destroy them. Artificial intelligence can revolutionize medicine or eliminate jobs. Genetic engineering can cure diseases or create new forms of inequality. Azazel, in this context, becomes a symbol of human ambivalence toward transformative knowledge. The apocryphal texts also reveal aspects of Azazel's story that complicate simple narratives of good versus evil. Although he is clearly presented as a figure who brought corruption to the world, there are also elements in his characterization that suggest more complex motivations. His teachings, although considered corrupting by the text's authors, also represented a transfer of power from the divine to the human. By teaching metallurgy, he not only introduced the capacity for more effective warfare, but also tools that could improve agriculture, construction, and craftsmanship. By revealing secrets of cosmetics and ornamentation, he not only introduced vanity, but also forms of artistic and cultural expression. This ambiguity in the moral evaluation of Azazel's actions reflects deeper tensions in the Judeo-Christian tradition about the nature of human knowledge. On one hand, there is a tradition that celebrates wisdom and learning as reflections of the divine image in humanity. Proverbs exalt the pursuit of wisdom. Ecclesiastes reflects deeply on knowledge, and its limitations. And many Jewish and Christian mystical traditions have seen in study and contemplation paths toward the divine. On the other hand, there is a current that sees in knowledge, particularly certain types of knowledge, potential sources of pride, rebellion, and separation from God. The figure of Azazel embodies this tension in particularly acute ways. As a watcher, he was originally a being dedicated to the observation and protection of humanity, roles that imply both knowledge and benevolence. His decision to share celestial knowledge with humans could be interpreted as an act of misdirected love, a desire to elevate humanity that ignored the consequences of such elevation. The Enochian texts do not present him as malevolent in his original intentions, but as mistaken in his methods and blind to the implications of his actions. This characterization of Azazel as a being who caused harm through good intentions makes him a tragic figure in the classical sense of the term. His fall is not the result of pure malice, but of a failure in judgment, an inability to foresee the consequences of his benevolent acts. This tragic dimension of his character adds emotional depth to his story and makes it more relevant to human experiences of regret, guilt, and the unintended consequences of our best intentions. The Book of Enoch also provides specific details about how Azazel's teachings interacted with those of other watchers to create a cumulative effect of corruption. While Azazel taught metallurgy and cosmetics, Semjasa revealed enchantments and the cutting of roots. Armaros taught the resolution of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel the constellations. Ezekiel the knowledge of clouds. Arachiel the signs of the earth. Shamsiel the signs of the sun. And Sariel the course of the moon. The combination of all this knowledge created a complete transformation of human culture, introducing not only new technical capabilities, but also new ways of understanding the cosmos and humanity's place within it. This detailed description of the different specialties of the Watchers suggests that the authors of the Book of Enoch had a sophisticated understanding of how specialized knowledge can combine to create far-reaching cultural and social changes. It was not simply that each watcher corrupted humanity in their specific area, but that the interaction between different types of knowledge created possibilities that no individual knowledge could have produced by itself. Metallurgy, combined with astrology, could lead to more precise calendars for warfare. Cosmetics, combined with enchantments, could intensify powers of seduction. Knowledge of plants combined with astronomy could develop more sophisticated forms of medicine or poison. This systemic vision of how knowledge interacts to produce cultural transformations is remarkably modern in its sophistication. The authors of the Book of Enoch understood that technological and intellectual innovations do not occur in isolation, but form complex networks of mutual influence that can amplify both the potential benefits and harms of any individual knowledge. Azazel, in this context, was not simply an individual corrupter, but a key node in a transformation network that fundamentally altered the trajectory of human civilization. Later tradition further developed the figure of Azazel, incorporating him into rituals and practices that reflected his role as a cosmic scapegoat. The Day of Atonement ritual described in Leviticus includes sending a goat to the desert for Azazel, an act that symbolized the transfer of the people's sins to a recipient who could carry them outside the community. This ritual suggests that Azazel had evolved from being simply an individual corrupter to becoming a symbolic receptacle for all human guilt and sin, a function that goes beyond his original role in the Enochian narrative. This evolution of Azazel from corrupter to scapegoat represents a significant theological development in ancient Jewish thought. While his role as a fallen watcher made him an explanation for the origin of evil, his function as a scapegoat transformed him into a mechanism for dealing with evil after it had manifested in the world. This duality, being both the source of the problem and part of its ritual solution, suggests a sophisticated understanding of how destructive forces can be ritually contained and directed toward constructive purposes for the community. The symbolism of the desert in relation to Azazel also deserves deep consideration. The desert in Semitic traditions is not simply a geographical place, but a symbolic space that represents the wild, the uncontrolled, that which exists outside the boundaries of ordered civilization. When Azazel is sent to the desert, both in his punishment described in Enoch and in his function as recipient of the scapegoat, he is being symbolically placed in the space where what is too dangerous for the community can exist without threatening social stability. The desert thus becomes a kind of symbolic container for what cannot be completely eliminated but must be kept at distance. This symbolic geography of Azazel's exile reflects deep psychological insights about how societies handle aspects of human experience that are simultaneously necessary and dangerous. The knowledge that Azazel represented, the capacity to wage war, to alter appearance, to manipulate materials and people, could not be completely eradicated once it had been introduced into human culture, but it could be ritually contained, symbolically exiled to spaces where its destructive power could be acknowledged without being allowed to completely dominate community life. The apocryphal texts also suggest that Azazel's exile was not permanent in an absolute sense. References to the great day of judgment, when he will be cast into fire, imply an eschatology in which his story will have a final resolution. This eschatological dimension adds another layer of meaning to his narrative. It is not simply a story about the origin of evil and its ritual containment, but also a story about the expectation that evil will finally be definitively conquered. Azazel, from this perspective, is a transitional figure whose power is real but limited in time. This limited temporality of Azazel's power offers a perspective of hope within a narrative that could otherwise be deeply pessimistic. If Azazel were simply an eternal corrupter whose influence could never be truly overcome, his story would be one of cosmic despair. But the promise of his final judgment and destruction suggests that the forces he represents, violence, vanity, manipulation, the destructive use of knowledge, are not permanent and unalterable aspects of the human condition, but temporary corruptions that will eventually be overcome. This eschatological hope in Azazel's story resonates with later mystical traditions that see in apparently destructive forces opportunities for deeper spiritual growth and purification. Some Kabbalistic texts, for example, suggest that even the darkest aspects of cosmic experience contain sparks of divine light that will eventually be liberated and restored to their original state of purity. From this perspective, Azazel is not simply an enemy to be destroyed, but a force whose corrupt energy will eventually be transformed and redeemed. If you have reached this point in our nocturnal exploration of the mysteries of Azazel, it is because your soul recognizes that there is something deeper than simple entertainment in these ancestral stories. This channel has become a refuge for restless minds like yours, who find in the quiet of the night the perfect moment to contemplate questions that the day does not allow exploring with the depth they deserve. By subscribing, you not only join a community of nocturnal seekers, but guarantee that you will have regular access to narratives that understand your need to find meaning in the hours of wakefulness. Here, you will discover week after week new stories of fallen angels, apocryphal texts, and biblical mysteries that not only educate your mind, but calm that spiritual restlessness that keeps you awake. Allow these ancient accounts to become companions of your insomnia, guides that transform your nights of anxiety into moments of deep contemplation and inner growth. Your nocturnal search for answers does not have to be solitary, and the knowledge you seek is waiting to be discovered in each new video. The influence of Azazel's story extended far beyond primitive Jewish texts, penetrating Christian, Islamic, and Western esoteric traditions in ways that demonstrate the enduring power of this particular narrative about the origin of evil and human corruption. In early Christian tradition, although the Book of Enoch was not included in the official biblical canon, its influence can be detected in several New Testament texts. The Epistle of Jude makes explicit reference to Enoch and his prophecy, suggesting that at least some New Testament authors were familiar with the Enochian traditions and considered them theologically significant. The early church fathers also struggled with the implications of the traditions about the Watchers and Azazel. Some, like Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria, incorporated elements of these narratives into their explanations of the origin of evil and human corruption. Others, like Augustine of Hippo, developed theologies of original sin that, although different in specific details, addressed similar questions about how corruption entered the human world and was perpetuated through generations. The tension between these different explanations of the origin of evil, whether through the disobedience of Adam and Eve, through the corruption of the Watchers, or through some combination of both, continued to influence Christian thought for centuries. In the Islamic tradition, figures that seem to correspond to Azazel and the Watchers appear in various forms, although with significant differences in detail and interpretation. The jinn, beings of fire who possess free will like humans, are sometimes presented in roles similar to those of the Watchers, as intermediaries between the divine and the human who can influence the development of human civilization, both positively and negatively. Iblis, the Islamic figure that roughly corresponds to Satan in Christianity, shares with Azazel characteristics of being an originally celestial being whose disobedience resulted in exile and enmity toward humanity. However, the Islamic tradition generally maintains a different perspective on knowledge and its transmission to humanity. While the Enochian narrative presents Azazel's teachings as inherently corrupting, the Islamic tradition typically sees knowledge as a divine blessing that can be misused by those who receive it, but which is not corrupt in itself. This difference in perspective reflects distinct theological approaches to the nature of knowledge, human responsibility, and the relationship between the divine and the human Western esoteric traditions have shown particular interest in the figure of Azazel, often reinterpreting him in ways that contrast markedly with the negative evaluations found in traditional religious texts. Some currents of Western occultism have presented Azazel as a liberator who brought essential knowledge to humanity, freeing it from ignorance imposed by celestial authorities who preferred to keep humans in a state of infantile dependence. This reinterpretation transforms Azazel from corrupter to benefactor, from villain to tragic hero, who sacrificed his celestial position to elevate humanity. This rehabilitation of Azazel in certain esoteric traditions reflects broader changes in Western attitudes toward knowledge, authority, and individual autonomy. In cultural contexts that value innovation, questioning of authority, and independent pursuit of truth, a character like Azazel can easily be reinterpreted as a Promethean figure who challenged oppressive authorities to benefit humanity. This reinterpretation does not necessarily deny the potentially destructive aspects of the knowledge Azazel imparted, but frames them as necessary prices for human growth and autonomy. Western literature and art have also found in Azazel a figure rich in symbolic and narrative possibilities. From 18th century Romanticism to contemporary works of fantasy and horror, Azazel has appeared as a complex character embodying fundamental tensions about knowledge, power, and moral responsibility. In these literary reinterpretations, his tragic nature is often emphasized, a being who possessed divine wisdom and power, but used them in ways that resulted in his own destruction and the corruption of those he attempted to help. The apocryphal texts also reveal aspects of Azazel's personality that go beyond his role as instructor of forbidden arts. He is described as a being of great charisma and influence, capable of attracting followers among both angels and humans. This leadership capacity was not simply the result of his superior knowledge, but also of a deep understanding of the desires and needs of those to whom he addressed himself. He knew exactly what knowledge would be most attractive to humans, what secrets would awaken their curiosity and ambition most deeply. This psychological intuition of Azazel suggests that his corruption of humanity was not an accident or the result of innocent misunderstanding of human nature. The texts imply that he perfectly understood the most vulnerable aspects of the human psyche and directed his teachings specifically toward those vulnerabilities. When he taught metallurgy, he was not simply transmitting technical information, but appealing to the human desire for power over their environment. When he revealed secrets of cosmetics and ornamentation, he was addressing deep needs for acceptance, attractiveness, and social status. This manipulative dimension of Azazel's activity adds a darker layer to his characterization. He was not simply a benevolent teacher who inadvertently caused harm through miscalculated lessons, but a being who consciously exploited human weaknesses to achieve his own objectives, whatever they were. This interpretation brings him closer to traditional characterizations of satanic figures who tempt through appeal to legitimate but misdirected desires. However, the texts also preserve elements of moral ambiguity in Azazel's characterization that complicate any simple evaluation of his motivations. His teachings, although they resulted in corruption and violence, also materially elevated human living conditions. Metallurgy not only allowed more effective weapons, but also more efficient agricultural tools, more durable construction structures, and more sophisticated art objects. Knowledge of cosmetics and ornamentation not only facilitated vanity and manipulation, but also developed forms of cultural and artistic expression that enriched human experience. This inherent duality in the consequences of Azazel's teachings reflects a sophisticated understanding by the ancient authors that technological and cultural progress is rarely uniformly beneficial or harmful. Each advance brings with it both possibilities for human flourishing and potentials for destruction and corruption. The Enochian texts recognize this complex reality, but maintain that certain types of knowledge were too dangerous to be shared with a humanity that had not developed the moral wisdom necessary to use them responsibly. The question of timing in Azazel's teachings is crucial to understanding the moral perspective of the Enochian texts. It was not necessarily that the knowledge he imparted was intrinsically evil, but that it was given at a time in human history when the species did not have the necessary social, moral, or spiritual structures to integrate it constructively. A more mature humanity, more morally developed, might have received this same knowledge without experiencing the massive corruption that the texts describe. This perspective on the progressive moral development of humanity suggests that the authors of the Book of Enoch had a dynamic vision of human capacity to handle powerful knowledge. They did not see humans as inherently incapable of wisdom, but as beings who needed time and experience to develop the maturity necessary to handle certain types of power responsibly. Azazel, from this perspective, was guilty not so much of imparting malevolent knowledge, but of prematurely interfering in the natural process of human development. The texts also suggest that there was something in Azazel's very nature that made him particularly susceptible to this type of error in judgment. As a watcher, his function was to observe and protect, roles that required maintaining separation from those under his care while simultaneously caring deeply about their welfare. This tension between separation and care may have created in him a frustration that eventually manifested in his decision to directly intervene in human development. Azazel's story can also be read as a meditation on the dangers of power without accountability. As a celestial being, Azazel possessed knowledge and capabilities that vastly exceeded those of any individual human. But he was not subject to the same limitations and consequences that humans would face for using such powers. This asymmetry of power and responsibility may have contributed to his inability to fully foresee the consequences of his actions. He could impart powerful knowledge without having to personally live with all the ramifications of how that knowledge would be used. This interpretation of Azazel's story as a warning about power without accountability resonates strongly with contemporary concerns about the responsibility of those who possess powerful knowledge or technologies. Scientists who develop new technologies, political leaders who make decisions affecting millions, technologists who create platforms that shape social behavior all face versions of the dilemmas that Azazel faced. How to use power and knowledge responsibly, how to foresee unintended consequences, how to balance potential benefits against potential risks. The Enochian texts also reveal that Azazel's punishment was not only retributive, but also preventive. By chaining him in the desert and covering him with stones, the divine judgment not only punished him for past actions, but also prevented future interference in human development. This preventive dimension of punishment suggests a theology that sees the protection of vulnerable humanity as a priority that justifies extreme measures against those who would threaten their welfare, even when those threats come from ostensibly benevolent motivations. The specific geography of Azazel's exile also contains deep symbolic meanings that connect with broader traditions about the desert as a place of spiritual transformation. In many religious traditions, the desert is the place where prophets receive revelations, where spiritual seekers confront fundamental truths about themselves and their relationship with the divine. Azazel's exile to the desert can be understood not only as punishment, but also as a forced opportunity for contemplation and potential repentance. However, the texts do not suggest that Azazel took advantage of this opportunity for constructive reflection. Instead of experiencing repentance and transformation in his desert exile, he seems to have remained impenitent, maintaining his corrupting influence over humanity, even from his prison of stones. This impenitence can be understood as evidence that his corruption was deeper than a simple error in judgment, that it represented a fundamental alteration in his character that made him incapable of truly recognizing the destructive nature of his actions. The figure of Azazel, seen from this perspective, becomes a representation of how pride can blind even the most intelligent and powerful beings to the consequences of their actions. His inability to recognize his error and repent, even when faced with the devastating consequences of his teachings, suggests that there was something in his character that valued his own will and judgment more than the welfare of those he claimed to be helping. This characterization of Azazel as fundamentally proud and impenitent differentiates him from other tragic figures in religious and mythological literature who experience recognition and repentance after their falls. His story thus becomes a warning not only about the dangers of misapplied knowledge, but also about the dangers of pride that prevents learning from errors and course correction when one's actions prove destructive. The apocryphal texts also hint that Azazel's influence did not completely end with his imprisonment. References to his role as recipient of the scapegoat in later rituals suggest that his presence continued to be felt in the human world, that his legacy of corruption required continuous ritual measures to be managed. This persistence of his influence suggests that the consequences of destructive actions can continue reverberating long after the original actor has been removed from the scene. This persistence of Azazel's legacy can be understood as a reflection on the enduring nature of cultural transformations. Once certain knowledge has been introduced into a culture, once certain capabilities have been developed, it is extraordinarily difficult to uninvent them or completely eliminate their influence. Metallurgy, once learned, cannot be easily forgotten. Warfare techniques, once developed, tend to evolve and spread. Knowledge of manipulation and deception, once acquired, is transmitted through generations. This irreversibility of cultural change induced by Azazel's teachings adds an additional tragic dimension to his story. It was not simply that he had made bad decisions that resulted in temporary negative consequences, but that he had initiated processes of change that would continue affecting humanity indefinitely. His moment of decision had ramifications that would extend through millennia, touching countless future lives that would never know of his existence, but would be shaped by the consequences of his actions. This cosmic and temporal responsibility in Azazel's characterization makes him a figure of extraordinary moral weight. He was not simply responsible for the immediate consequences of his teachings, but for all future ramifications that would flow from them. Every war fought with metal weapons, every deception facilitated by cosmetics, every act of vanity inspired by ornaments could, from this perspective, be traced back to his original decisions. However, this total responsibility also raises complex questions about the nature of moral culpability across time. To what extent can an individual be responsible for the unintended consequences of their actions that manifest generations later? Is it fair to attribute to Azazel all blame for corruptions that arose from human use of knowledge he imparted, especially when those uses were modified, developed, and applied by countless human individuals over centuries? The Enochian texts seem to respond affirmatively to these questions, suggesting that Azazel is indeed responsible for the entire chain of consequences that flowed from his original teachings. This perspective reflects a view of moral responsibility that emphasizes the importance of carefully considering the potential long-term consequences of powerful actions, especially those taken by individuals in positions of great influence or authority. This extended responsibility ethic has significant implications for how we understand moral responsibility in contemporary contexts. If we accept the principle implicit in Azazel's condemnation, then those who introduce new technologies, ideas, or capabilities into the world have a moral responsibility that extends not only to the immediate consequences of their innovations, but also to the ways those innovations might be used or misused by others in the future. This perspective of extended responsibility is both ethically and practically challenging. Ethically, it raises questions about how far it is reasonable to expect individuals to foresee and take responsibility for all possible consequences of their actions. Practically, it could lead to a paralysis of innovation and progress if rigorously applied, since almost any new capability or knowledge has the potential to be misused. The authors of the Book of Enoch seem to be aware of these tensions, but maintained that certain types of knowledge were so dangerous that the responsibility for careful consideration was especially crucial. The knowledge that Azazel imparted was not neutral in its implications, but had clearly destructive potentials that should have been evident to a being of his intelligence and experience. His culpability was not just for unintended consequences, but for failing to recognize and respond appropriately to consequences that should have been foreseeable. This distinction between truly unpredictable consequences and those that should have been foreseen by a competent intelligence is crucial to understanding the moral condemnation of Azazel in the Enochian texts. He was not condemned for every negative consequence of his actions, but specifically for those consequences that a being of his capacity should have anticipated and prevented. His culpability was increased by his position of superior knowledge and power, which gave him both greater capacity to foresee consequences and greater responsibility to act on those foresights. The story of Azazel, in its multiple dimensions and complexities, finally offers not only a mythic explanation of the origin of certain human evils, but also a profound meditation on themes that remain urgently relevant. the nature of knowledge and its dangers, the responsibility of those in positions of power and influence, the unintended consequences of well-intentioned actions, and the challenges of balancing progress with prudence. His figure continues to resonate not because it provides simple answers to these complex questions, but because it embodies them in ways that invite continued reflection and moral evaluation. The legacy of Azazel extends beyond the confines of ancient texts into the very fabric of human experience. Every technological advancement we witness, every moral dilemma we face regarding the use of powerful knowledge, echoes the fundamental questions his story raises. In laboratories where scientists unlock the secrets of genetic manipulation, in boardrooms where artificial intelligence policies are decided, in the quiet moments when individuals must choose between personal gain and collective well-being, the shadow of Azazel's choices continues to inform our understanding of what it means to wield knowledge responsibly. The Enochian authors understood something profound about human nature that modern psychology has only begun to fully appreciate: that knowledge, once gained, becomes part of the collective human inheritance, passed down through generations not merely as information, but as capacity for both creation and destruction. Azazel's teachings did not simply add to humanity's toolkit. They fundamentally altered the species' relationship with power, beauty, warfare, and manipulation. These alterations became embedded in human culture so deeply that they now seem natural, inevitable aspects of civilization rather than the revolutionary departures from innocence that the ancient texts understood them to be. This permanence of cultural change, induced by Azazel's intervention, speaks to one of the most haunting aspects of his story: the irreversibility of certain kinds of knowledge. Unlike material objects that can be destroyed or lost, the conceptual frameworks and technical capabilities he introduced became part of humanity's permanent intellectual DNA. The knowledge of how to forge weapons could not be unlearned. The understanding of how appearance could be manipulated for social advantage could not be forgotten. The awareness that materials could be transformed for both beneficial and destructive purposes became an indelible part of human consciousness. Yet, within this apparent tragedy lies a more complex truth that the Enochian texts acknowledge even as they condemn Azazel's actions. The same metallurgical knowledge that enabled more devastating warfare also allowed for more efficient agriculture, more durable architecture, more beautiful art. The cosmetic arts that introduced vanity and deception also opened pathways for creative expression, cultural identity, and the celebration of beauty. The understanding of materials and their manipulation that Azazel provided became the foundation not only for weapons of war, but for the tools of civilization itself. This duality suggests that the authors of the Book of Enoch were grappling with a recognition that would become central to all subsequent human ethical thinking: that powerful knowledge is inherently neutral, but its applications are inevitably moral choices that reflect the character and wisdom of those who employ it. Azazel's tragedy was not that he possessed dangerous knowledge, but that he shared it at a time and in a manner that maximized its potential for harm, while minimizing the safeguards that might have channeled its power toward constructive ends. The theological framework within which the Enochian authors situated Azazel's story provides insights into their understanding of divine pedagogy and the proper timing of revelation. The implication is that there exists an appropriate sequence for the acquisition of knowledge, that certain understandings require prerequisite wisdom, moral development, and social structures before they can be safely integrated into human experience. Azazel's error was not malicious intent, but pedagogical malpractice, a failure to respect the natural order of learning that would have allowed humanity to develop the ethical frameworks necessary to handle powerful capabilities responsibly. This perspective on the proper sequencing of knowledge acquisition resonates deeply with contemporary educational philosophy and developmental psychology. We recognize that children must learn basic social and emotional skills before being given access to more sophisticated tools and information. We understand that societies need legal and ethical frameworks in place before adopting transformative technologies. The Enochian condemnation of Azazel can be read as an early recognition of these same principles applied on a cosmic scale. The ritual dimension of Azazel's story, particularly his role as the recipient of the scapegoat in Levitical ceremonies, adds another layer of complexity to his character that transcends simple moral categories of good and evil. As the designated bearer of communal sin, Azazel becomes a figure who enables purification and renewal precisely through his association with corruption and exile. This paradoxical role suggests that even the most problematic aspects of existence can serve constructive purposes when properly contained and ritually channeled. This transformation of Azazel from active corrupter to passive sin-bearer represents a sophisticated understanding of how communities can metabolize and integrate the negative consequences of past actions. Rather than simply trying to eliminate or deny the corruptions that his teachings had introduced, the ritual system acknowledged their reality while creating mechanisms for their symbolic management and eventual transcendence. The desert exile of the scapegoat became a way of honoring both the reality of corruption and the possibility of its eventual resolution. The eschatological dimension of Azazel's story, with its promise of final judgment and the ultimate defeat of the forces he represents, provides the temporal framework within which his corruptions can be understood as temporary rather than permanent features of existence. This future-oriented perspective transforms what could be a narrative of cosmic despair into a story of hope deferred but not abandoned. The evils that Azazel introduced are real and consequential, but they are not the final word in the human story. This eschatological hope embedded in the Azazel narrative has sustained communities of believers through centuries of experiencing the very corruptions his story explains. Wars fought with metal weapons, social manipulations enabled by cosmetic arts, and the general increase in human capacity for both creation and destruction that his teachings facilitated are not seen as permanent features of reality, but as temporary distortions that will eventually be corrected in a larger divine plan. This perspective allows for honest acknowledgement of present difficulties while maintaining hope for future resolution. The psychological dimensions of Azazel's character, particularly his apparent inability to recognize the destructive consequences of his well-intentioned actions, speak to universal human experiences of good intentions gone awry. Most people can identify with the experience of trying to help someone and inadvertently causing harm. of sharing knowledge or resources in ways that ultimately prove counterproductive, of making decisions that seem wise at the time, but reveal their foolishness only in retrospect. Azazel's story validates these experiences while warning of their potential magnitude when the actor possesses great power or influence. This psychological accessibility of Azazel's dilemmas makes his story relevant not only to those in positions of obvious power, but to anyone who has ever faced decisions about what to share, what to teach, what to reveal to others. Parents deciding how much of life's harsh realities to reveal to their children, teachers choosing which knowledge to impart and in what sequence, friends determining what advice to offer to those facing difficulties, all participate in smaller versions of the choices that led to Azazel's downfall. His story serves as both warning and encouragement. Warning of the potential consequences of poorly timed or inadequately considered sharing of powerful knowledge. Encouragement that the capacity to learn from such mistakes is part of what distinguishes wisdom from mere intelligence. The literary and artistic legacy of Azazel demonstrates the enduring power of his story to generate new interpretations and applications across widely different cultural contexts. From medieval Christian allegories to romantic poetry to contemporary fantasy literature, his figure has been repeatedly reimagined in ways that speak to the concerns of each era while preserving the essential core of his dilemma. This adaptability suggests that the fundamental tensions his story embodies between knowledge and wisdom, between power and responsibility, between individual will and collective welfare, are truly universal aspects of conscious existence rather than culturally specific concerns. In our current historical moment, when humanity possesses technological capabilities that would have seemed godlike to previous generations, when individual decisions can have global consequences, when the pace of change often outstrips our ability to understand its implications, the story of Azazel feels particularly urgent and relevant. Like the ancient watchers, we possess knowledge and power that can dramatically alter the conditions of life on earth. Like Azazel, we face choices about how to use these capabilities, what knowledge to share, what innovations to pursue, what consequences we are willing to accept in exchange for the benefits we hope to achieve. The climate crisis, the development of artificial intelligence, the manipulation of genetic codes, the creation of weapons of mass destruction, the design of social media platforms that shape human behavior, all represent contemporary versions of the kinds of choices that Azazel faced. In each case, powerful knowledge exists that can be used for tremendous benefit or tremendous harm, and the outcome depends largely on the wisdom, timing, and ethical framework within which that knowledge is applied. The Enochian perspective would suggest that the most important question is not whether we should pursue such knowledge, but whether we have developed the moral and social frameworks necessary to handle it responsibly. Are our educational systems producing individuals with the ethical sophistication to wield powerful technologies wisely? Are our governance structures adequate to the task of regulating capabilities that transcend national boundaries and traditional categories of law? Are our spiritual and philosophical traditions providing guidance that is relevant to dilemmas that previous generations could not have imagined? These questions take on additional urgency when we consider the irreversibility principle embedded in Azazel's story. Once certain knowledge is released into the world, once particular capabilities are developed, the genie cannot easily be put back into the bottle. The knowledge of how to split atoms, once discovered, becomes part of humanity's permanent toolkit, available for both power generation and weapons development. The techniques for manipulating DNA, once perfected, will be used for both healing diseases and potentially creating new forms of biological warfare. The algorithms that enable artificial intelligence to understand and respond to human behavior can serve both beneficial and manipulative purposes. This irreversibility means that decisions about the development and deployment of powerful knowledge carry weight far beyond their immediate context. Like Azazel's choice to share metallurgical and cosmetic secrets with early humanity, contemporary choices about technological development will have consequences that ripple through generations, shaping the world that our descendants will inherit in ways we can only partially foresee. The story of Azazel thus becomes not merely an ancient tale of angelic rebellion and divine justice, but a template for understanding the moral dimensions of living with powerful knowledge in any era. His exile to the desert of Dudael represents not just punishment for past mistakes, but a recognition that some consequences must be lived with even as we work toward their eventual resolution. The stones that cover him symbolize the weight of responsibility that comes with the capacity to shape the world through knowledge and action. In these quiet hours of the night, when the complexities of modern life seem most overwhelming, when the pace of change feels too rapid for comprehension, when the weight of collective human knowledge presses down upon individual consciousness, the ancient story of Azazel offers both warning and comfort. Warning that the power to transform the world comes with responsibilities that extend far beyond personal intention or immediate consequence. Comfort that the struggles we face in trying to use knowledge wisely are not new, that previous generations have grappled with similar dilemmas, that the tension between innovation and wisdom is a fundamental aspect of conscious existence, rather than a unique burden of our particular historical moment. The desert exile of Azazel can be understood not only as punishment, but as a form of contemplative retreat, a forced meditation on the consequences of action that parallels the quiet reflection that comes in the hours before dawn. In the silence that surrounds us now, as we process the complexities of his story and its relevance to our own choices and circumstances, we participate in a form of vigil that connects us across millennia to all those who have wrestled with questions of knowledge, power, and responsibility. Perhaps this is the deepest gift that the story of Azazel offers. Not simple answers to complex questions, but companionship in the wrestling. Validation that the struggle to use knowledge and power wisely is worthy of our most serious attention and effort. His tale reminds us that the consequences of our choices extend far beyond ourselves, that the knowledge we possess is both gift and burden, that the decisions we make in trying to help others can have ramifications we never intended or imagined. As the night deepens and consciousness begins its gentle drift toward rest, the figure of Azazel can serve as both warning and benediction. Warning to consider carefully the consequences of our actions, particularly when we possess knowledge or power that others lack. Benediction in the recognition that the very fact that we wrestle with these questions that we feel the weight of responsibility for the knowledge we possess, is itself a sign of the moral development that makes it possible to wield power more wisely than those who came before us. In the end, the story of Azazel is not merely about an ancient angel who made a catastrophic error in judgment, but about all of us who must daily navigate the challenges of living consciously in a world where knowledge is power, where actions have consequences, where the choices we make today will shape the world our children inherit. His exile to the desert becomes a metaphor for the contemplative space we must all enter to examine our relationship with the knowledge we possess and the power we wield, however modest it might seem in comparison to his celestial capabilities. In these silent hours of the night, when the noise of the world fades and we are left alone with our deepest thoughts, the story of Azazel can serve us as a mirror in which we examine our own relationships with knowledge, power, and responsibility. His dilemmas become our dilemmas. His decisions become lenses through which we examine our own choices. In the quietude that precedes dawn, when the mind finally finds peace with the complexities that had kept it awake, we may discover that humanity's oldest stories continue to offer wisdom for the soul's most modern challenges. May this nocturnal contemplation bring you not only understanding, but also the deep rest that comes when the mind has found, at least temporarily, sufficient answers to allow sleep to arrive with the softness of a long-awaited blessing.